working on a new philosophy essay. I just started about a half hour ago, so I'll begin reading it. There existed there within whereof the lowlands of rolling green valleys shaded by as yet unclimbable mountains, long before the Greeks supposedly invented philosophy, a people of passage and place who, on the verge of a form of life whereof which would include philosophical reason, realized in modern time by their adopted a method of life including three essential objectives: ensuring generational to generational survival. These three things were the wearing of clothes that referred to many mythology as the hiding of sin and primitive vice from your creator, and secondly the respectable burying of the dead, and thirdly and last of these three, the fashioning of various tools required for the building of shelters and the hunting of the two sources of food, both different. One agricultural, the second much sharper tools made into weapons for the hunting of game. The different types of tools for two different purposes. All this would be impossible if philosophical thought were not born as yet, at an ancient time and place, much more so previous to what civilization drew into advancing from the confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile, and the Greeks. And the richness of physical richness of the converging of those three rivers and the earth nearby them created great advances in societies, civilizations. Previous to what civilization drew into advancing from a confluence of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile. If this is true, it would postulate a newer philosophical theoretic placing the birthstone of philosophical thought much earlier than it has always been thought to have been brought into the cementation of being with the Greeks and the easier putting into practical usage by the meeting and dispersing of these three rivers, bringing about the pasteurization of animals and growing to harvest of farm crops. Philosophical thought thereby requires limitation and boundary, the two of which are made essential to our survival by the limiting of both time and space. Now this goes into a completely way far previous area, here. Limiting of both time and space, which are the prototypal parentage of all sensory perception. So, space is divided by the universal creating of division into smaller and larger units of space, requiring time as in one way the expanding of space through the taking of spatiality's divisibility into separate units and extending the unit of smaller parts of space, and through the same divisibility into smaller and larger enumerations thereby. But how is this brought about? It must be through the same dawning of extracting and extending as one and same of each. This is metaphorically very similar to the opening of the sensory perception of sight into time, sight being one example of space and time another. The same way we humans discovered that by placing a stick into the earth and rubbing it faster and faster between both hands, a fire would start. when absolute nothingness began through the abstraction of the smallest particle of itself, a flame was born into the mediating nature of which found the center of the completion of nothingness through the bursting into the centrality of divisibility. It was like looking into a mirror of itself through time and space, in the exploding birth of stationary flame, and the closest visual description of which would be the twin mirrors of the planet Saturn, the twin mirroring of the planet Saturn, like time looking into itself, the mirroring of both time and space, opening first sight and then breath. When sensory perception of sight found heat to be absolute centrality, a clockwise motion of flame began, pulling from the farthest regions of instantaneous created time, the stationary and at the same time circular nature of orbitude. The closest way of explaining this metaphorically is that of universal consciousness as eternally born through the gaze of orbiting time's material subtracting nature toward spatially awakening flame. The orbit of matter around the centrality of flame is more so akin to the spatial perception, not of smell, but of the patriarchal nature of breath. So it's like seeing and breathing was spontaneously and prototypally, it would be visible as rings bursting out from rings of flame of gravity bursting out from the centrality of flame, which is brought about in the same way in smaller and smaller units. And the sight and breath of time and space both come into being through the lowest enumerational possibility of abstraction and subtraction from the absolute unity of nothingness. Now, if you think about it, before time expanded space, what word would you use for what the Earth was in a state, that the whole universe was in a state of? It would come closest to crucifixion, actually. Not the kind of crucifixion we invented, but it would be absolute solidity, which is one of the older philosophers had solidity, impenetrability, and then extension. That's another way of putting it. So that's the beginning of this philosophical essay I'm working on now. So I hope everybody's doing all right, and remember, something's going to happen in June, guaranteed, when that solar eclipse. I hope it's a great thing. So, well, take care, everybody.